Trinity. The sun baked Los Alamos that June, and no rain fell. The grass turned brown. The wells dried up. We brushed our teeth with Coca-Cola, an Army nurse remembered. Oppenheimer's teams were working through the night, grabbing a few hours of sleep in their new tech area offices. A new crisis erupted nearly every day with at least one of the bomb's 500-plus components. On July 2nd, George Kistiakowsky x-rayed his custom-made plastic explosives just to make sure they were perfect. When he held the films up to the light, the shapes were dotted with tiny dark spots, air holes. Oppenheimer got on the phone to Washington. Between coughing fits, he pleaded with Leslie Groves to authorize a delay of the test. Groves refused. President Truman was leaving in a few days for Potsdam, Germany, where he was going to meet with Joseph Stalin to begin talking about post-war plans. It was becoming clear that when the war ended, the United States and the Soviet Union would be the only world powers left standing, and that they'd be rivals. Potsdam would be Truman's first meeting with the famously intimidating Soviet leader. Truman wanted to know that the United States had a working atomic bomb. He wanted to stun Stalin with the news. Oppenheimer begged for just a few more days. The chances of a successful test before July 20th, he said, were 50-50 at best. Groves demanded the test go ahead on July 16th. Time and time again, we had in the technical work almost paralyzing crises, Oppenheimer later said. Time and again, the laboratory drew itself together and faced the new problems and got on with the work. This time, the solution came from a steady-nerved George Kistiakowsky. I got hold of a dental drill, he said. Kisti knew the explosives were extremely unstable. Any sudden jolt could set them off. Not wishing to ask others to do an untried job, I spent most of one night, a week before the Trinity test, drilling holes in some faulty casings so as to reach the air cavities. He mixed a batch of liquid explosives and, drop by drop, gently filled the holes. You don't worry about it, he said. I mean, if 50 pounds of explosives goes in your lap, you won't know it. On July 3rd, several cars drove up to a brick mansion surrounded by gardens, meadows, and woods. The car doors opened, and out stepped a few British soldiers, followed by 10 of Germany's best scientists. Otto Hahn was there. So was Werner Heisenberg. The Germans asked the British where exactly they were and why they'd been brought there. They got no answers. Instead, they were taken inside and each given a pretty private room. They were told they could walk in the garden, play volleyball on the lawn, listen to the radio, eat and drink as much as they wanted. They could do anything at all, except leave. What the Germans learned only later was that they were at an estate called Farm Hall in the countryside of southeast England. They'd been taken there to keep them out of the hands of the Soviets, but there was more to it. The goal was to isolate the Germans, to keep them from even mentioning the words atomic bomb in public. If the Allies were going to use the bomb against Japan, they wanted it to have maximum shock value. They wanted it to come out of nowhere. The Americans and British were also eager to learn exactly how much these German scientists had figured out about building atomic bombs. Before the Germans arrived, British intelligence officers set up hidden microphones all over Farm Hall. The first conversation the mics picked up was an exchange between Heisenberg and the physicist Kurt Diebner. I wonder whether there are microphones installed here, Diebner asked. Microphones installed, Heisenberg said, laughing. Oh no, they're not as cute as all that. On July 5th, Oppenheimer sent a telegram to top Manhattan Project physicists in Berkeley and Chicago. Any time after the 15th would be a good time for our fishing trip. This was their prearranged code. The test was on, and anyone who wanted to see it had better get out to New Mexico right away. On July 11th, Oppenheimer kissed his wife goodbye and drove out to the desert. The next day, Philip Morrison, one of Oppenheimer's former students, removed the plutonium bomb core from a vault in the Los Alamos tech area. He carefully set the pieces into 2 padded suitcases equipped with thermometers. If a chain reaction began, the rising temperature would be the first clue. Morrison carried the suitcases outside to a waiting Army car. He set them on the back seat and sat down beside them. A driver started the engine and drove through the gates. I was just thinking about what an extraordinary thing it was to be driving along there in just an ordinary car, remembered Morrison, and yet we were carrying the core of the first atomic bomb. 5 hours later, the car arrived at the Trinity site and stopped in front of an abandoned adobe ranch house. Morrison carried the cases past armed guards and into the building. The inside of the houses was spotless. The window frames were covered with black tape to keep out flying dust. Morrison set the plutonium down next to a table by the wall. Then he tried to get some sleep. Final assembly of the bomb would be done in the morning. At about noon the next day, an Army truck bumped and bounced very slowly down the dirt road leading to the Trinity site. In the back of the truck were George Kistiakowsky's molded explosives. The truck backed up to the steel tower that was built to hold the bomb. Kisty jumped down. Using a large crane, soldiers eased the 5-foot-wide ball of explosives out of the truck bed and set it down on the sand. Then they began putting up a white tent around the bomb. At the same time, at the ranch house, the physicist Robert Bacher supervised the assembly of the bomb's plutonium core. 8 scientists, dressed in white surgical coats, stood around a table putting the pieces together. Outside the door sat 4 Army jeeps, engines running in case a quick getaway became necessary. Several times, Oppenheimer stuck his head into the room to check on the progress, like an anxious husband whose wife was in labor. Bacher finally asked him to stay away. He was making everyone even more nervous. The phone in the ranch house rang at about 3 o'clock. It was Kistiakowsky calling from the tower to say the explosives were ready. Bacher drove the plutonium to the tower. In the tent by the tower, Philip Morrison used a long pair of pincers to steady the plutonium core as it was lowered on a wire into a metal tamper inside the huge ball of explosives. It didn't fit. Several men cursed. Oppenheimer leaned forward and peered into the bomb. We halted our efforts in order not to damage the pieces, remembered one of the physicists. Could we have made a mistake? No problem, Bacher assured everyone. The plutonium had expanded in the heat of the ranch house. If they left it out for a few minutes, it would cool off and contract again. They waited several minutes in silence. They tried again. The plutonium slid right in. Early the next morning, at Los Alamos, Major Robert Furman and Captain James Nolan loaded a 300-pound lead bucket into the back of an Army truck. Furman signed a receipt and got into one of the 7 cars surrounding the truck. Inside the bucket was uranium-235. It was on its way to the American Air Base on the Pacific island of Tinian. The pilot, Paul Tibbets, and his crew were already there. Whether the plutonium bomb worked or not, the plan was to have 1 uranium bomb assembled and ready for use by early August. The convoy drove to Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, and from there flew to Hunters Point Naval Shipyard near San Francisco, where the cruiser USS Indianapolis was docked, ready to take sail west. That morning, at the tower at Trinity, Oppenheimer watched as scientists and Army engineers worked together to attach a steel cable to the test bomb. When everything was set, a motor-powered crane lifted the 5-ton round metal bomb off the ground. Soldiers ran under the bomb and tossed down a thick pile of cotton mattresses, low-tech protection in case of a potentially disastrous fall. The bomb swayed and turned in the breeze as it was lifted, just a foot a minute, toward the top of the tower. At the top, 2 engineers helped ease it down onto a wooden platform and secured it in place. A team of scientists climbed the tower and began attaching wires and detonators all over the bomb's surface. July 15th was a day for final checks. At about 4 that afternoon, after weeks of blue skies, dark clouds rolled over the desert. Lightning flashed above the distant mountains. Early in the evening, Oppenheimer climbed the steel tower alone. On the top of the wooden platform was a metal shack with 3 walls, open on the 4th side. Inside the shack was the fully assembled bomb, a huge gray globe held together by bolts with wires snaking in and out all over its surface. Oppenheimer looked over his work. The test was set for 4 the next morning. There was nothing more he could do. Nothing but imagine last-second problems. Oppenheimer was really terribly worried, remembered the chemist, Donald Hornig. He thought someone had better babysit it right up until the moment it was fired. The 25-year-old Hornig got the job. He grabbed a book and climbed to the tower. On the platform beside the bomb was a folding chair. A single 60-watt bulb hung from the roof of the open metal shack. There was a telephone in case of trouble. By then, there was a violent thunder and lightning storm, said Hornig. The possibility of lightning striking the tower was very much on my mind. He calmed himself with the knowledge that if lightning struck, the tower's steel frame would most likely conduct the electricity harmlessly into the ground. Or perhaps the electrical burst would set off the bomb. And in that case, I'd never know about it, he said, so I read my book. General Groves arrived at the Trinity site later that night, got out of his car, and looked angrily at the sky. Rain was falling, wind whipping, lightning flashing. He found Oppenheimer, and they discussed the weather. It was a serious problem. They needed clear skies to get a good look at the explosion, but far more worrisome was the danger of spreading radioactive fallout. When the uranium atoms in the bomb split, some would break down into other radioactive elements, atoms that would continue shooting out particles. If the wind blew this deadly fallout into rain clouds, it could literally rain down on nearby towns. Without a break in the wind and rain, the test could not go forward. Groves and Oppenheimer agreed to meet again at 1 a.m. to assess the situation. "Get some sleep," said Groves. Then he found a cot and shut his eyes. Oppenheimer walked to the mess tent. He sat on a bench, drinking coffee and smoking, reading poetry and listening to the rain pound the canvas roof.